Welcome back, Netrunner fans. Willingdon here, and I am back for part 2 of my Order and Chaos review. This is going to cover the runner cards, which are largely Anarch cards in this box. I want to get into it right away because we have a whole lot of stuff to cover in this video, and I want to start with the 3 IDs that are in the box. The first ID is Edward Kim, Humanity's Hammer. He's got a link. He's 4515 as normal. He's a natural, and he says, trash the first operation you access each turn at no cost. Well, this is a pretty interesting and I would say distinctly Anarch effect. Without Kim, there's really not a whole lot of ways to trash operations in the game. Imp is probably the easiest way to do it without this ID. I think maybe we could draw some comparisons to Wizard with Edward Kim, just because both of them give you the ability to trash cards in a way that is really difficult to do otherwise. But I think Kim is probably a little better than Wizard. Being able to trash operations is going to really undermine the economy of a lot of corporation decks. We see a ton of hedge funds and that type of thing played in basically every corp deck. Being able to access those and trash them is going to be strong, especially off of like R&D. I also think that it's reasonably useful to be able to trash things like Scorched Earth or Neural EMP. There's quite a few flatline-oriented decks that kind of just sit comfortably back as they build up their flatline kill method, and this is definitely going to undermine that to a certain extent. So I think Kim has a role in the game that we haven't really seen with any other IDs. I do think aggressive is going to be the way that you have to play this guy. If you're not trying to make lots of runs and trying to get lots of accesses, I don't know why you'd play this ID over something like Reyna. I really like this guy. I think that he gives us some options for aggression that we didn't have before, and I think Quetzal and now Kim have given us ways to build really early aggressive Anarch decks and do some disruptive things to most corps. The next ID is Max, and that's with 2 X's. Maximum Punk Rock. She has 0 link, she's a Gmod, and she's 4515 like normal. When your turn begins, trash the top 2 cards of your stack. Draw 1 card. If this card existed maybe 6 months ago, I think it would have been a lot stronger than it is in the current environment. Anarch's always had some problems with drawing cards, and Wildside has largely been their only option. Now we're starting to see a lot of new options for Anarch, though. Things like Inject, Earthrise Hotel, and some cards that are in this box have given Anarch the ability to draw cards and actually keep pace in that way. That's something Anarch's always had trouble with, and I think Max giving you that free card every turn would have been a lot stronger prior to the printing of some of the things I'm talking about. As it is, I'm not really convinced that this is going to be the ID to play unless you have something to do with the fact that your heap is getting filled with cards. So off the top of my head, I'm thinking things like Retrieval Run seem pretty good with Max. You'd be able to knock some, big Morningstar, just some big program into your discard and then use Retrieval Run to get it back. You could hypothetically do some other things, but that's probably the best thing I can come up with. So I think if you don't have a reason to do something with those 2 cards that you're putting in your discard, I'm not convinced that the single draw every turn is going to be worth it, especially in light of some of the cards in this box and some of the recent releases. So this is an interesting ID. I certainly expect people to be trying to use it, and I don't think it's bad by any means. I'm just not sure that the trade-off of the milling 2 cards a turn is worth it when you could just play some of the quality draw options that we have otherwise and get, like Noise's ID or just a different ID. I do expect there to be some more ways to mess around with the heap in the future for Anarch. That seems to be kind of something that they can do in kind of different ways than Shaper does it. So I expect there to maybe be some options with Max in the future, but this is probably my least favorite of the 3 new IDs. The last ID is Valencia Estevez, the Angel of Cayambe. She is a natural. She has 0 link. Her deck size is 50, which is interesting, and 15 influence. Her only ability is the corpse starts the game with 1 bad publicity. So this ID is good for a huge number of reasons. First of all, bad pub is just good. Having a recurring credit every time you make a run is going to be really strong, especially when you consider that Anarch doesn't really have economy effects tied to the ID, right? Like Wizard is probably the closest thing that we have to an economy effect being built into the ID. You could maybe argue that Quetzal also is that to a certain extent. This is just going to straight up give us credits if we're making runs. That's pretty good. Not having to pay to use icebreakers or whatever, having a discount on icebreakers. Just having bad pub is good. Now, another thing to mention is that NAPD contract is by and large the most popular agenda in the game. So this is going to make it cost 1 more for the corp to score. It's hypothetically also going to make it easier to steal because you have that recurring credit. So that's just kind of nice. Now, the other thing to mention is that there are certain effects in the game that trigger off of bad publicity. The most obvious one is blackmail. This is a run effect that's been, I think, attempted in several decks, but hasn't really ever worked because it's been so incredibly difficult to give the corp bad pub. So if the corp doesn't give themselves bad pub, blackmail is just kind of a dead card in your deck. This is going to be reasonably good in her deck because they're going to start with a bad pub. So you kind of have an inside job sort of effect built into blackmail. I think it's probably going to be worth including at least 1 or 2 copies of blackmail in her deck. And this is the type of ID that I think has a lot of long-term potential to get better. If we see more effects that use bad publicity or involve bad publicity, such as later in this box, she's just going to get better over time. So I really like this ID. I think the 50 cards is an interesting sort of penalty, and I think that this really breaks some of the rules in the game in a really interesting way. So I really like this ID, and I'm anxious to see what people come up with for it. Moving past the IDs, we come to the events, and we're going to start with one called Amped Up. This costs 1 to play, it's 3 influence, and it says, gain 3 clicks and suffer a brain damage that cannot be prevented. Well, this is a pretty weird and cool effect for Anarch. I don't really know how good it's going to be, but we've already seen quite a few ways for Anarchs to spend large numbers of clicks. Things like Duggars or Quest Completed definitely reward you for having access to more than 4 clicks. I think maybe Amped Up could have some potential with those cards or something where you're able to break the normal paradigm of 4 clicks and get a lot of value out of it. There's also already some ways to gain clicks within Anarch, such as Joshua B. So it's potentially possible to have an Anarch deck that gets like a whole ton of clicks all in one turn. I don't really like this card a ton. I think if you could prevent the brain damage somehow, it would be a lot better and would be more of a combo-oriented card. But as it is, it's going to be pretty painful to play this card, and I think you're going to have a really good reason to be willing to suffer that brain damage in order to just get the clicks. So I'm anxious to see what people do with this. I expect it to be combined with some of those heavy click cards, but I don't really see this being that good right away. The next event is called Ive Had Worse. It's 1 to play, 2 influence. It says, draw 3 cards. Whenever Ive Had Worse is trashed by taking net or meat damage, draw 3 cards. This is the type of card that is so obviously good, there isn't a whole lot to say about it. When I first saw this card spoiled, I was like, yeah, that's amazing, and tons of Anarch decks are going to play that. It's basically just a diesel that costs a credit, but we don't have to spend the influence on Diesel, and that's pretty huge. Just having access to another draw effect, even if it didn't have that damage thing, I think we would still play it for that reason. Now, the damage thing is going to be helpful and is going to be pretty decent. I think it's going to matter a lot more against PE than it is against Scorched Earth. If you've looked at the current ruling, that there was just some tweets about it. Basically, this card does not save you from a Scorched Earth by itself. You have to evaluate how much damage you would take, and if that would flatline you, then you die before this gets to trigger. I don't think that really matters that much, to be honest. I think really the fact that this is just a Diesel for no influence is the best thing about this card. The damage thing is nice, but overall, I think just having another burst draw effect in Anarch is the big thing with this card. The next event is called Itinerant Protesters. It costs 2 to play, 2 influence. It's a current, and that means that it's not trash until another current is played or an agenda is scored. So in other words, the corp scores. The corp's maximum hand size is reduced by 1 for each bad publicity he or she has. Well, would you look at that? That is a runner current with a game-altering powerful effect. I think most of the other runner currents seem like responses to corp currents. I think Net Celebrity is pretty clearly the best one so far, and it's mainly played, I think, to get rid of enhanced login protocol. That's why I play it, at least. This thing has some real balls to it, and if the corp has more than one bad pub, this is going to be brutal. Even just one bad pub, it's going to be pretty mean. So this has some pretty obvious synergy with Valencia we looked at earlier, and I think maybe a deck that could give the corp several bad pub is going to really be able to use this to good effect. So I really, really like this. Just being able to reduce their hand size is going to make it hard to manage the agendas, especially if you have some further denial effects like credit denial or making agendas more difficult to score. So this is going to be pretty hard to use, and I'm generally not in favor of cards that require other cards or effects to be good, but this one seems like there's quite a bit of payout. So I'm interested to see what people do with this. It's going to be really narrow, probably only going to work in Valencia, but maybe we could see some other bad pub decks in the future. The next event is called Showing Off. That seems very Anarch to me. It's a run event. Cost 2, it's 3 influence. Make a run on R&D. If successful, instead of accessing cards from the top of R&D, access cards from the bottom of R&D, starting with the bottom card and working your way up. Well, this card's kind of funky and I think is kind of bad, but I do see some maybe interesting uses with it. The main thing I'm seeing is multi-access effects. So let's say that we have a medium charged up to 3 or 4, and for some reason that isn't going to win the game on its own, so we can play Showing Off to access cards on both the top and the bottom of the deck, right? We could make a normal run on R&D and access 3 or 4 cards, and then be able to access a whole fresh set of cards off the bottom of the deck. That's maybe a thing. It could also potentially be good against corp effects that either stack the deck or, look through the deck or do various things like that. Maybe something like Yagura. I don't know. I'm really not seeing this being that good. It's interesting, and I think maybe this is a card that could make more sense in the future, but I certainly don't see this being worth including in your deck just for the medium thing or the multi-access thing I was talking about. I think if you can get access to like 3 or 4 cards at a time, you should be able to win with just that. I don't think you really need to look at 3 or 4 off the bottom to be able to win. I think if you have an unchecked medium, that's pretty much GG. I don't know. I'm willing to see what happens with this card. I think this is a card that's going to make more sense in the future. The next event that we have is called Wanton Destruction. It's 1 to play. It's 4 influence. It's a run sabotage type. Make a run on HQ. If successful, instead of accessing cards, you may spend any number of clicks to force the corp to trash an equal number of cards from HQ at random. This is probably my favorite card printed for a long, long time. I really, really like this card. The 4 influence is really encouraging as an Anarch player since so many of our best cards are low influence. Here's a bomb run event that's going to be difficult to play outside of Anarch that has a really good and unique effect that only Anarch can accomplish. There's so many good things you can do with this card. I think not the least of which is playing it first click just to force the corp to res some HQ ice, right? If you play this, they're pretty much going to have to defend unless they want to just lose all their cards. So this is going to be good at getting the critical agendas that may have piled up in their hand out of their hand. It's going to be good at dealing with the flatline things that they've been constructing in their hand throughout the course of the game, getting rid of their Scorched or whatever. This card rules. I just see this having a huge number of uses, and I think it's particularly effective with some of the cards that are later in this box as well. So, man, is this card cool. There's just a lot of things you can do with it, and I love having a new, really powerful, threatening event that will give aggressive Anarchs some more options. So this card is awesome. I 5 stars. The next event is called Day Job. It's 2 to play, it's 1 influence. As an additional cost to play this event, spend 3 clicks. Gain 10 credits. Well, this is another card that's so obviously good, it's kind of boring, right? This card just rules. We've needed economy options in Anarch for a huge amount of time, and here's one that's actually good. I think the biggest thing that I'm seeing with this is using it in prepaid-oriented strategies. We might be playing that outside of Anarch. Prepaid Kate has had to spend a lot of her influence on Lucky Find and just getting the prepaid thing to work. I think maybe since this is a 1 influence card, it might be easier to use this instead of Lucky Find or in addition to Lucky Find. But it also might make it possible to play a prepaid-oriented Anarch deck. Since we're going to have access to this, we can spend some of our influence on Lucky Find. Even outside of prepaid, I think this is a pretty solid overall card. It's basically like you get to use Magnum Opus 4 times to a certain extent. I think this is just a really solid card all around. And even if this wasn't a good card, can we just stop for a second and talk about how awesome the artwork on this card is? The art is seriously so good. If you have friends that don't play Netrunner, you should just show them this card because I feel like this card conveys the feeling and flavor of Netrunner maybe better than anything else. I just love this card. The next 3 events are all a cycle, and the first one is Forked. It is a run-type sabotage. Cost 2, it's 3 influence. Make a run. The first time you break all subroutines on a century during this run, trash that century. So this is the first of 3 run events that are going to allow us to trash the 3 different main types of ice. I think the century one is pretty clearly the best, just because centuries tend to be the biggest pain in the butt to run over and over. I had the sneaking suspicion that one day Anarch would be more focused on destroying ice than they are just with Parasite, and Forked is certainly going to be a cool option. Having the ability to trash the things that you're having the most trouble with extends the life of lots of your limited use icebreakers, things that like the dogs or Overmind or things like that. It's also going to work really well with an icebreaker that's later in this box. So Forked, really solid, and I feel pretty much the same way about the next 2 as well. So you might have guessed the next one is Knifed, and this is Run Sabotage. It only costs 1 though, 3 influence as well. Make a run. The first time you break all subroutines on a barrier this run, trash that barrier. There's a few reasons why this one has some interest versus the other ones. This works pretty well with the Quetzal E3 thing to deal with some of the big barriers that we've been seeing. It's also pretty clearly good against Bioroids, especially Eli 1.0, where you wouldn't even have to have an icebreaker. You could just click through and destroy Eli. So this seems pretty decent all around. It's got some obvious use against ice that people are already playing, and I like that this fits in with the cycle. So I anticipate this seeing some amount of play within Anarch. You've probably guessed the last one in the cycle is Spooned. This is 2 to play. It's a run sabotage as well, also 3 influence. Make a run the first time you break all subroutines on a code gate this run, trash that code gate. Probably the most notable thing about this one versus the other 2 is its interactions with the kit ID. I messed around with that a little bit, and I'm not too excited about it. I don't think Kit really wants to spend her valuable 10 influence on this thing, but at the same time, this is a pretty powerful effect that she can have access to. Being able to make any problematic piece of ice into a code gate and then destroy it seems pretty decent. I think all around this one has about the same level of playability as the other 2, and I really just like the idea that Anarch's getting more ice destruction effects, particularly in the run event format. Now we're moving on to the programs, and this is probably the biggest bomb in the box, I would say. It's called Eater, it's 4 to install, it's 1 MU, 3 influence, and it starts with 2 strength. It's an Icebreaker AI. It has credit Break Ice subroutine. You cannot access more than 0 cards for the remainder of this run. And then it has credit +1 strength. Well, Darwin, eat your heart out. This is seriously such an incredible icebreaker, especially for an AI breaker. Let's just go through exactly what this card does and why you'd want to use it. So it has kind of a funky wording with the you cannot access more than 0 cards. Why would you want to access 0 cards? Well, the main reason it's worded that way is because we can use things that replace the access. So there's a huge lot of cards that we can use with that. I would say the most notable, or at least one of the most obvious, is Keyhole. With this card and Keyhole, you're going to be able to use this to get in, and then you're going to be able to use the Keyhole effect since it replaces the access. It's also going to work with the Wanton Destruction we looked at earlier. It's going to work with Vamp, Account Siphon, Retrieval Run. There's just a huge list of things that replace the access that this is going to let you use. And the fact that it's a 3 influence icebreaker makes me very happy as well. This is giving us a serious bomb icebreaker that has a very unique style and is only in Anarch. I absolutely love this card, and I think the design of this is really solid. This is going to give us a lot of headaches as the Corp, and it's going to force us to play a little differently than we have in the past. This card's really good. I anticipate there being a lot of Anarch decks that use both Keyhole and Eater to really good effect. It seems to me like if you don't have a way to deal with that with your corporation deck, you're going to have a lot of trouble in the coming months. So this is a really great icebreaker. I like that it's very unique. It's very different than a lot of the other AI icebreakers. And I really think that David and now this have given us some really solid reasons to play aggressive Anarch decks. I really, really like Eater, and I'm very excited to get this to the table. This is going to be an absolute monster in the right deck. The next program is called Gravedigger. It is 2 to play, it's 1 MU and 2 influence. It's a virus. Whenever an installed Corp card is trashed, place 1 virus counter on Gravedigger, and then it has click, remove hosted virus counter. The Corp trashes the top card of R&D. Well, this card has a very important limitation on it, and that is installed Corp card. So this isn't going to work with things like noise or the wanton destruction that we just looked at. You're going to have to somehow trash a card that is already installed. Now, it is worth noting that it works when either player trashes that card. So if the Corp, for whatever reason, installs over their ice or something like that, then this is still going to trigger. Also, like if you trash their pad campaign in their remote or whatever, then this is going to trigger as well. I do think that there's maybe some uses for this, especially with some of the other virus-oriented things that are later in the pack. I don't necessarily see immediately what deck is going to want to play this, but I do think that there might be an emerging archetype that is based on just trashing the corp's entire deck, right? So there might be a virus-oriented deck in the near future that's primary method of winning, or at least a solid way of winning, is to run the corporation out of cards. I think to a certain extent, Noise is already capable of doing that, and I think adding one or two of these to a Noise deck could have some utility, but I think this card's probably going to be a lot better if you have ways to charge it up, or you have ways to gain virus counters on it that aren't just trashing installed corp cards. So this is a solid and very interesting card, and I like to see more options for kind of funkier or narrower decks to emerge. The next program that we have is called Hivemind. It's unique, it's a virus, 3 to install, 2 MU, and 5 influence. Place 1 virus counter on Hivemind when it's installed. Virus counters on Hivemind are considered to be hosted on all other virus programs and can be spent as if on them. Well, here's a card for all of you Power Gamer players out there. I think we've been looking for some monster program out of Anarch for quite some time, and I think here it is for you. That said, I don't really see this being very good or playable. It seems too awkward to really get a whole lot of value out of it. Let's just talk for a second about some of the best things that we can do with this. It has some obvious synergy with like Nerve Agent and Medium. If you're able to get several virus counters on this, all of your other things that have some sort of trigger based on viruses are going to get a lot better. It works fairly well with that, and I think maybe playing some of the out-of-faction virus cards could work well with it as well. I don't really like this card so much. I think you're going to have to really focus your whole deck strategy around this thing to even get a good value out of it. I don't really see this being worth the time or the MU, but I am anxious to see if somebody comes up with something cool with this card. It's certainly an interesting card, and it's certainly a powerful card. I just think that it's probably going to be too hard to use to be worth it when you can just do like Cash Shop Noise or something like that and have a much more effective virus strategy. The next program is called Progenitor. It is a daemon type. Installs for 0, it's also 0 memory, and it's 2 influence. You may host a single virus program on Progenitor. The memory cost of the hosted program does not count against your limit, and whenever virus counters are purged, you remove all but 1 virus counter on the hosted card. Well, if you thought Hivemind was awesome, you're probably going to like this card as well. I don't really see this card having a whole lot of use in the Noise, Cash Shop sort of style of virus decks that we've mainly been playing so far. I mean, what are you going to do? Like, keep your Medium having a counter on it? Like, make your Data Sucker not get purged as much? I don't really see why you would want to use this in, like, Noise, or at least the way that we've been building Noise so far. But this could potentially be very good with a virus-oriented deck that's trying to build lots of counters on a card. It's going to at least keep 1 or 2 cards from being totally purged, and I see maybe having several of this in play with several viruses hosted, and then maybe also using Fester as a way to make it really difficult and punishing for the corp player to use Purge. That said, I think you've got to have a really good reason to provoke them to Purge, right? Like, you're going to have a really good, powerful thing that you're doing with all those virus counters, and frankly, I just don't see what you're going to do. So maybe in the future, if there's some more bomb stuff to do with virus counters, this could be really good. But I think for now, I'm probably going to leave this in the box. Now we're getting to the hardware. And the first one we have is Archives Interface. It is 3 to install. It's 2 influence. Whenever you access cards in Archives, remove one card in archives from the game instead of accessing it. Really quickly, I want to go through how accessing archives works. Basically, the way it works is you turn all the cards face up, and then you choose to access them one at a time. So with this, you're going to be able to see the card that you're going to not access. And I think that is going to be pretty good against things like shock or just nasty stuff. Maybe that Cyberdex thing that we saw in the last video. I think generally this card could have some use in the future. For right now, I'm not seeing a whole lot of incentive to play this card, but man, do I really, really like removing stuff from the game as an effect, especially within Anarch. I feel like that's something that they kind of uniquely claim, or maybe should uniquely claim, since they're all about destroying stuff and ruining everything. So I really like this card. I don't think it's really that good, but I think that this is the type of thing that needs to exist in the game, and maybe in the future, if there's decks that are utilizing archives full of nasty stuff to protect various things, this is going to be a good way to address that. So, interesting card. I'm not 100% sold on its use, but it does seem like this is the type of thing that needs to exist in the game. I'm pretty excited about it. The next piece of hardware is called chopbot 3000. It's unique, 1 to play, and 1 influence. When your turn begins, you may trash another of your installed cards. If you do, draw a card or remove 1 tag. This card isn't overwhelmingly good, but it does seem like it has some pretty decent use all around. Generally with Anarch, we have a lot of junk that we can get rid of, and we've been using Aesop's Pawn Shop as the main way to deal with that. Potentially this could replace Aesop's, maybe supplement Aesop's, especially if you had a reason to use the remove a tag ability. So I think probably the remove a tag is the thing that sets this apart. I think drawing 1 card every turn is decent, but I think generally speaking, you're going to have enough draw, especially within Anarch, now that we've seen all these new Anarch cards, that you're not going to need this. I do think this has some playability, and the fact that it's 1 influence is going to make it reasonable even outside of faction. I could see some criminal decks that would want to use this to ditch tags and draw a few extra cards. I'm not wild about this card, but it's an okay card, and I think it could see play. The next piece of hardware is called Memstrips. It's a chip type. It's 3 to install, and it's 2 influence. Plus 3 MU, use the MU on Memstrips only for virus programs. Well, I don't know about you, but I've found that Grimoire is giving me plenty of MU to install my virus programs. I'm not exactly sure that I need this thing to give me some more MU. The biggest use I'm seeing out of this card is probably Overmind or maybe like Sage, things that having a lot of MU would be useful for one reason or another. I really don't see like a noise deck or the current virus decks needing more MU. If anything, I feel like we have too much MU with a Grimoire in play. It's very, very rare, especially when we also have access to Jin to run out of MU. So this card's kind of lame in my opinion, but I do think that it could maybe see some play with the cards I previously talked about like Sage and Overmind. Next up, we have a new console for Anarchs. This is Vigil. It's unique, as the consoles are. 2 to install, 2 influence. It's plus 1 MU. When your turn begins, draw a card if the corp has cards in HQ equal to his or her maximum hand size. And as the consoles are, limit 1 per player. I think there's some comparisons to be made to Astrolabe with this card, just because it's such a general use and easy to satisfy console for a deck that doesn't want to play Grimoire or one of the other available consoles. I think it's going to be pretty easy to get the plus 1 card out of this on, I would say, almost every turn. I think the Corp can play around it a little bit, but the tendency for most Corp decks is to sit near or at their max hand size for most of the game. This has some obvious dyssynergy with things that are going to trash the corpse hand, like wanton destruction, but it also fits pretty well with like itinerant protesters that we looked at earlier in the pack, ways to reduce the corpse maximum hand size. So this card, I think, has some playability. It's pretty easy to use, and it's going to give you a way to draw a few cards and give you that MU without a whole lot of investment or effort. So I like this. Just having another decent console in Anarch is going to be really useful. I don't really see it being worth playing outside of Anarch. Now we're getting into the resources, and the first one that we have is called Human First. It's unique, and it's 1 to play, 2 influence. It's a connection. Whenever an agenda is scored or stolen, gain credits equal to the agenda points on that agenda. This card would be way better if it wasn't unique. Being able to have multiple of it in play could potentially get you a lot of credits, but I think as it is, this is still going to be a halfway decent way to generate some credits, especially if you have a way to get it early in the game, maybe like hostage. So this card's okay. I think that it's got some potential to produce maybe like 5-6 credits throughout the course of the game at least, and that's probably going to be worth it in the right deck, especially if you have a way to trash this card like Aesop's, or you just have something else going on with either connections or resources. So this could potentially see some play, I think. I really like the flavor of this card. The flavor text and artwork really do justice, and I think it conveys the story of the game really well. I think I like that a little bit more than what the card does, honestly. The next resource that we have is called Investigative Journalism. It's 0 to play, and it's 1 influence. Install only if the corp has at least 1 bad publicity. 4 clicks, trash, give the corp 1 bad publicity. Well, here's finally a way to give the corp bad publicity that doesn't suck really bad. I think that this has some obvious use in the Valencia deck, and I really, really like the flavor and just design of this card. You're going to be able to install this down early in the game with Valencia if you draw it. You don't even necessarily have to use it right away, and if they later get rid of their bad pub or something, you're still going to be able to fire this off as long as you installed it first. So I really like this card. I think that it's going to be pretty hard to use, but this is definitely one of the most reasonable ways in the game to give the corp bad publicity, and I think that there's probably going to be a fair enough reasons to use it in the Valencia deck, especially with itinerant protesters. This is going to be a way that you can get the corp max hand size really low. Making it reduced by 2 or maybe even 3 could be really, really strong and make it really awkward for them to either flatline you or keep their agenda safe. So I like this card a lot. I think the flavor and design of it is really well done, and I'm pretty anxious to see if people can get this to work, especially in the Valencia deck. The next resource is called Sacrificial Clone. It's 3 to install, and it's 4 influence. Trash. Prevent all damage. Trash all installed hardware, all installed non-virtual resources, and all cards in your grip. Lose all credits. Remove all tags. This card is a reprint of sorts of one of the most notorious cards in original Netrunner. I think that this version is a lot less stupid than the original was. This is definitely not as good, and I think that it's going to be difficult to play this card, but it is pretty interesting. This gives us a new option of dealing with the big flatline effects, and I think in the future, if we see meat damage effects that do more than 4 damage, like if we see Super Scorched Earth, the original Netrunner had quite a few of those, then this could be a pretty easy solution to those. It's also reasonably good against things like Ronin or whatever, to a certain extent. I also really like the remove all tags aspect, especially against mid-season. So I think that this card does have some playability, but man, is it going to be a huge burden when you lose your whole hand and everything. And I think it could potentially be really dangerous in the wrong situation, especially against Jinteki if they have like Neural EMP after you use this. So this card's interesting. I think it could maybe see some use in a resource-oriented Anarch deck, but it's definitely going to be hard to use, and I think you're going to have a very specific reason for including it. The next card that we have is also a resource. It's a connection called Stim Dealer. It's 4 to install, 3 influence. When your turn begins, if there are 2 or more power counters on Stim Dealer, remove all power counters from it and suffer a brain damage that cannot be prevented. Otherwise, place a counter on it and gain a click. Well, this card is also sort of a reprint of a popular card from original Netrunner, but I think that this is actually pretty good and maybe playable. This is kind of Joshua B that isn't as terrible, and I think that this particularly has some use in a supplier-oriented deck, or just kind of a generally resource-driven Anarch deck. This is going to be pretty decent all around at giving you extra clicks if you have something good to do with extra clicks. I really don't think it's that bad to suffer 1 or 2 brain damage, so you're going to get a lot of clicks before the brain damage even starts to matter, and if you wanted to avoid the brain damage, you could get rid of this with either Aesop's or the Chopbot 3000. So this seems pretty useful. I think that it could see play in the right Anarch deck, but that 4 cost I think is going to make it hard to use unless you have a pretty big econ. So I think like the cash shop style econ is probably not going to like this all that much. I really want to try this card with Supplier. I think it has some potential in there. The last resource that we have is called Virus Breeding Ground. It's 2 to install. It's also 2 influence. It's a virtual type resource. When your turn begins, place a virus counter on it, and then it has click, move a virus counter to another card with at least 1 virus counter on it. So this, along with Incubator and Hivemind, shows promise to be a emerging new type of virus deck that's focused on building up a bunch of virus counters and putting them all into one thing and doing something powerful. That said, I'm not sure what that powerful thing is. It seems like maybe you could do something crazy with like a huge deep dig on medium. You could potentially have some power with like parasites having a lot of counters with hivemind. And I think it could potentially be decent with like hemorrhage or the gravedigger that we saw earlier. So I'm not exactly sure how to justify this new sort of virus strategy, but it does seem like there's enough there with Incubator, this, and Hivemind to think about playing some sort of big, lots of virus counter-oriented Anarch. I'm not sure I want to try to build that, and I'm not sure that Noise is really going to want to do it that much. So for now, I think this idea is sort of in limbo for me, but it does seem like we're starting to see enough stuff there that this could be a real archetype. As the last few cards in the box, we have a couple neutral cards. The first one is an event. It's called Uninstall. It costs 0. It's also 0 influence. Add an installed program or piece of hardware to your grip. This card is kind of bad, but I think that it might be worth playing in the right deck. The most obvious thing I'm seeing with this is a replacement for Scavenge if you're trying to reset counters on cards. So within Anarch, we have David and we have the dogs and maybe Overmind as well. There's a few different things that we might have in play that come into play with counters, and then we need to refresh those somehow. And I think the easiest way to do that overall is probably Scavenge, and that's a 2 influence card. So if we want sort of a poor man's Scavenge that we're mainly just using to reset those counters, I think that could potentially be strong. It's also worth noting that it works with hardware, though there aren't exactly a lot of hardware that you would want to use this with. Plascrete is pretty much the only one that I can think of. So I think this card maybe has some narrow playability with the programs that I just talked about. The next card that we have is a piece of hardware. It's called Kianju PT. It's a vehicle. It's 2 to install and 0 influence. When your turn begins, you may lose a click. If you do, avoid the first tag you take until the beginning of your next turn. Well, here's a new tag avoidance effect that I think is substantially less bad than the ones that we have like Decoy and New Angeles City Hall. I think this is maybe going to be an alternative to Plascrete, depending on what the Scorched Earth metagame looks like in the near future. I really like the idea of just having more options to avoid tags, especially ones that are 0 influence neutral cards. So this seems like a pretty good card to just have in the game. That said, it's obviously not going to have any use against a lot of decks, especially the ones that don't do anything with tags, and that spending a click is certainly a penalty. So I'm not immediately going to take all my Plascretes and turn them into this, but I do like having more options against tag effects within the game. The final card in the box is called Data Folding. It's a virtual resource, it's 3 to install, and it's no influence. When your turn begins, you gain a credit if you have 2 or more unused MU. So this is kind of Underworld Contacts that doesn't suck and is actually usable. I like this all around just as a new resource that produces credits. I think it could have some potential with Supplier that I've talked about before. I think it could also have some potential in the Overmind, Sage sort of lots and lots of unused MU deck. So I think that this card is definitely going to be playable, but it's going to be really hard to use in your average deck. I don't think you're going to be able to recoup that initial 3 install cost in very many decks, and the fact that it's a resource is going to make it somewhat a liability. But I like having this as an option for the resource-driven decks, and I think that this is quite a bit better than Underworld Contacts. Even though we've seen quite a few people try to play Underworld Contacts, I think that this is probably going to be a sort of replacement for that. And it's a lot easier to use since you don't really have to have a link or anything like that to make this work. Well, that brings us to the end of Order and Chaos. I want to give a few brief remarks. This is my favorite Netrunner release so far within the game. I just love what this does to the game. It's given Anarch economy options, draw options, and unique, unparalleled bombs that no other faction can do. These are all problems that Anarch has had, I think, since Core Set, and the last few data packs plus this box have shored that up a lot. I also really, really like that Wayland Glacier is probably going to be a thing. I really see it being potentially really strong, especially with those advanceable ice and the different ice options that we have now. I really, really like what this box is doing for the game, adding a lot of diversity, not necessarily making the strategies that are already strong stronger, instead making the strategies that have been weak or kind of the areas of the card pool that have been weak better. This is just an incredible release, and I think that if you were even hesitating about buying this is a must-buy. Way over the data packs, I consider this to be a fantastic release. All around, I really, really like this big box, and I think that if they can release big boxes with this quality level, this game is headed places. So I hope you like this review. If you did, please click subscribe and the button that looks like a thumbs up, and I'll be around to review some more Netrunner stuff.